For 100 days, the United States has been negotiating with Iran to end a war, sending mediators to Doha, accepting Pakistani facilitation in Islamabad, waiting for responses through Omani backchannels, reading statements issued by an Iranian supreme leader who has not been seen, heard, or publicly confirmed as alive and functioning since the first day of the conflict. And a senior American official, speaking to Axios in March, summarized the situation in words that should have stopped every negotiator in their tracks. "It's beyond weird," the official said. "We don't think the Iranians would have gone through all this trouble to choose a dead guy as the supreme leader. But at the same time, we have no proof that he is taking the helm." Watsons, 100 days into a war. 21 simultaneous missile attacks on American bases across 3 countries launched in the past 48 hours. Active diplomatic talks running through Qatar and Pakistan. And the United States government does not know who is actually giving orders in Tehran. That is not a rhetorical observation. That is the operational reality that American negotiators, military planners, and intelligence agencies have been working around since February 28th. And it is the most dangerous unknown in the most dangerous conflict of 2026. To understand the full weight of the vacuum that was created on the first day of this war, you need to understand who Mojtaba Khamenei was before February 28th, and what Iran's political architecture looked like before an Israeli missile strike changed everything in the space of seconds. Mojtaba Khamenei was 56 years old when his father was killed. He had never held an elected position. He had never held a publicly acknowledged government appointment. For most of his adult life, he operated as what Iranian political analysts described as the power behind the robes, an unofficial power center within his father's office whose influence over appointments, purges, factional alignments, and the internal politics of the IRGC was pervasive and widely acknowledged within Iran, but almost entirely invisible to the outside world. He controlled access to his father. He managed the informal network of loyalists that extended from the IRGC's hardline command structure into the judiciary, the intelligence services, and the religious establishment. He was described by observers as fluent in English, knowledgeable about psychology, military sciences, and modern technology. He was, in the assessment of Iran analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations, the most powerful unelected figure in the Islamic Republic before his father's death. Which is precisely why, on March 8, 2026, with American and Israeli strikes still ongoing and the regime in acute crisis, the Assembly of Experts, the 88-member clerical body, constitutionally empowered to select the supreme leader, gathered and chose him. Within a system already stretched to its breaking point, they chose the one figure with existing informal authority over the institutions that needed to function. The calculation was institutional survival. Continuity over legitimacy, familiarity over formal qualification. It was, in the specific context of a decapitation strike that had just killed the father and 40 senior IRGC officials simultaneously, a defensible decision. What nobody at that assembly session accounted for was that the person they were choosing might not be capable of exercising the authority they were conferring. Because here's what actually happened on February 28, 2026, the day Mojtaba's father was killed. According to leaked audio obtained by The Telegraph, Mojtaba Khamenei escaped death that morning by minutes. He had left his father's compound for a walk shortly before the Israeli airstrike struck the complex. He returned to find it destroyed. His father was dead. His wife, Zahra Haddad Adel, killed alongside his father in the compound at the moment of the strike. Senior IRGC commanders dead. The command structure of the Islamic Republic's military and theological leadership decapitated in a single coordinated blow. And Mojtaba himself, according to the statement broadcast on Iranian state television when he was named supreme leader on March 9th, was described as having been wounded in the war. The term used by Iranian state broadcasters was janbaz, meaning one who has given his body in service to the enemy's attack. The Iranian ambassador to Japan told reporters that his injuries were not impairing his function. United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told Pentagon reporters on March 13th that Mojtaba was wounded and likely disfigured. One Iranian diplomat confirmed injuries. One said those injuries were light. Reports citing a senior source in the Kuwaiti newspaper Al Jarida suggested he had been secretly evacuated to Moscow for medical treatment. A diplomatic memo obtained by the Times of London placed him in the holy city of Qom, receiving treatment with sources describing him as incapacitated. The White House said Trump believed he was probably alive but damaged. The CIA and Mossad, according to Axios, were watching every Iranian communication and behavior pattern for direct evidence of Mojtaba's activity. They found indirect evidence, Iranian officials trying to schedule in-person meetings with him, unsuccessfully due to security concerns. They found no direct evidence of him giving orders. And in March, when Nowruz arrived, the Iranian New Year, the occasion on which every supreme leader since the founding of the Islamic Republic has addressed the nation, Mojtaba's message was read by a television presenter. No voice, no video. A written statement on a screen. The regime's information management around its own supreme leader became, by April, so strained that it took an action that represented an extraordinary confession about the depth of the problem. CNN reported in April that the Iranian regime had used artificial intelligence-generated videos to show Mojtaba Khamenei delivering messages. Not pre-recorded videos, not video with modified security precautions. AI-generated video, a synthetic face and voice composited to create the appearance of a functioning leader delivering communications, for a theocratic regime whose entire legitimacy rests on the divine authority vested in a living, present, spiritually certified supreme leader, using artificial intelligence to simulate that leaders' appearances is not a communication strategy. It is an admission that the physical leader is not available to appear, and that the regime has calculated the cost of that admission as higher than the cost of the deception. Trump confirmed in a Meet the Press interview on June 7th that he believed he probably knew where Mojtaba was located, but declined to say whether he would share that information. He described Mojtaba as very seriously injured. He said he would be open to a direct meeting if there were an agreement to end the war. The implicit message was unmistakable. Washington knows where the supreme leader is. Washington is watching him. And Washington is not certain whether the person it is watching is capable of authorizing the agreement that would end the conflict. A senior Israeli official told Axios in March, "We have no evidence that he is really the one giving orders." That statement was made over 2 months ago. The situation has not improved since then. And the consequence of a supreme leader who is wounded, in hiding, possibly incapacitated, unreachable by his own president, and invisible to his own population, is not simply a leadership mystery. It is a constitutional vacuum inside a theocracy at war. And into that vacuum, predictably, has moved the one institution that had the organizational coherence, the weapons, and the ideological determination to fill it. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, was already the most powerful institution in the Islamic Republic before the war began, with an economic empire estimated at 30 to 40% of Iran's gross domestic product, its own intelligence services, its own Quds force for external operations, its own Navy, Air Force, and Missile Corps. The IRGC was never simply a military branch. It was a parallel state that operated within the formal structures of the Islamic Republic, while simultaneously possessing the coercive capacity to override those structures whenever the formal government moved in directions the IRGC's command structure did not approve. That dynamic, already present before February 28th, has been transformed by the war into something qualitatively different, not a parallel state constraining an elected government, a military council replacing one. The evidence of this transformation is specific and documented. President Masoud Pezeshkian, who was elected on a platform of moderation and reform, has been systematically excluded from the decision-making structure since the war began. The IRGC forced Pezeshkian to appoint Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, despite objections from civilian officials, imposing a personnel decision through institutional coercion that the president lacked the power to resist. A military council composed of senior IRGC officers has, according to reports by Iran International, established control over access to Mojtaba Khamenei's location, preventing government reports from reaching him and effectively severing the president from the supreme leader. IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi stated publicly and explicitly that under wartime conditions, all critical positions must be chosen and managed directly by the Revolutionary Guards. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, the diplomat conducting nuclear negotiations with Western parties, cannot make commitments without IRGC approval. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was identified by Trump himself as Washington's interlocutor during the Islamabad talks, cannot authorize an agreement without Vahidi's approval. And on Sunday, Iran International reported that President Pezeshkian sent a formal resignation letter to Mojtaba Khamenei, stating in writing that he and his government have effectively been excluded from major and vital decision-making process, that the vacuum created by the IRGC's takeover has enabled hardline factions to control affairs, and that under such circumstances, he is unable to run the government and carry out his legal responsibilities. The IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency denied the resignation report. But the existence of the letter, detailed in a report whose sourcing Iran International has confirmed through multiple channels, reveals the depth of the internal fracture. The elected president of the Islamic Republic wrote to the supreme leader to report that he cannot function because the IRGC has seized control of the government, and received no clear response because the supreme leader's accessibility is itself an open question. A historical parallel makes the structural danger of this moment precisely visible. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, the Soviet Union was the world's second most powerful military state, in possession of nuclear weapons, controlling a vast satellite empire, and engaged in a Cold War competition that touched every corner of the globe. Stalin's death did not trigger a clear succession. It triggered a power struggle among the members of his Politburo. each of whom had survived by playing factions against each other, and none of whom had clear institutional authority to assume Stalin's role. Lavrenti Beria, the head of the security services, moved first, seeking to leverage the NKVD's coercive power to position himself as the dominant figure. He was arrested by his own colleagues within months and executed. Khrushchev emerged as the dominant figure only after years of internal maneuvering, during which Soviet foreign policy was partially paralyzed, and the military establishment operated with degrees of autonomy that Stalin would never have permitted. The most dangerous period of the Cold War's early decades was not the height of Stalinist power. It was the years immediately after Stalin's death, when the world's second nuclear power did not have a clearly functioning supreme authority, and when decisions were being made by institutional factions whose calculations reflected internal power competition as much as external strategic logic. Iran in June 2026 is not the Soviet Union in 1953, but the structural parallel is exact in one critical dimension: a regime whose entire decision-making architecture was built around a single supreme authority has lost that authority suddenly and violently. The institutions below that authority are now competing for the power vacuum rather than operating within a functioning hierarchy. The elected government wants a ceasefire and has been blocked from negotiating one. The IRGC wants to maintain the strategic leverage that the Strait of Hormuz closure and the ongoing military confrontation provides, because that leverage is the basis of the IRGC's claim to institutional primacy, and the Supreme Leader, who in theory holds the constitutional authority to resolve the dispute between these factions, is wounded, invisible, mediated through AI-generated videos, and described by American intelligence officials as someone whose command authority cannot be confirmed. The structural reality explains something about the current escalation cycle that pure military analysis cannot. The 21 simultaneous attacks on American bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan on June 9th and 10th. The Apache helicopters shoot down over the Strait of Hormuz. The rejection through Oman of the American MOU proposal on June 6th. These are not actions that reflect a unified Iranian strategic decision to escalate toward a definitive military confrontation. They are actions that reflect IRGC institutional logic, operating with reduced civilian oversight and a supreme leader who cannot or does not provide clear direction. The IRGC's economic empire depends on the strait remaining contested. Its institutional primacy depends on the narrative of existential threat that requires military organizations to lead. Its hardline command structure is ideologically incompatible with the nuclear concessions that any sustainable agreement with the United States requires. When Vahidi says that under wartime conditions all critical positions must be managed directly by the Revolutionary Guards, he is not describing a temporary wartime measure. He is describing the permanent institutional order that the IRGC intends to establish in the aftermath of a decapitation strike that removed the one figure with the authority to constrain it. There is a dimension of the leadership vacuum that has received less public attention than it deserves, and it is the most consequential one: the fatwa. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei issued a religious decree, a fatwa, prohibiting the development, production, and use of nuclear weapons, declaring them forbidden under Islamic law. This fatwa was the primary theological justification Iran used in nuclear negotiations to argue that its program was purely civilian in intent. It was the bedrock of every Iranian assurance to the IAEA and to Western negotiating parties that a nuclear-armed Iran was not the goal. The fatwa died with Khamenei. Mojtaba Khamenei has not reissued it. In the analysis published by Kuwait's Strategic Research Center, the nuclear question has shifted fundamentally. A new fatwa from the new Supreme Leader would be required to maintain the theological and legal framework that the old one provided. And a Supreme Leader who is wounded, invisible, potentially incapacitated, and operating through AI-generated video appearances is not issuing new religious decrees. The theological prohibition against the weapon that America and Israel launched this war to prevent is currently, as a matter of Islamic jurisprudence and Iranian constitutional law, in a state of suspension. The hardline IRGC commanders who now effectively control Iran's nuclear program do not share Khamenei Sr.'s consistent position on the fatwa's binding force. The program continues. The theological constraint on its endpoint does not have a currently functioning author. There is another dimension to this story that honest analysis requires acknowledging. The IRGC's effective seizure of government control is not universally endorsed within the Iranian system, and the resistance to it is real, even if it is currently unable to prevail. Pezeshkian's reported resignation letter is evidence of that resistance. Araghchi's continued participation in negotiations, his communications that frequently include signals of flexibility that the IRGC subsequently contradicts, suggest a civilian faction that is genuinely trying to achieve a negotiated resolution and is being systematically blocked. Ghalibaf's continued engagement in mediated talks, his Doha visit in May, despite the IRGC's opposition to the terms being discussed, reflects the same dynamic. The Islamic Republic is not monolithic in its desire for continued conflict. There are figures within its leadership who understand the economic destruction the war has produced, who see the street protests that preceded the war as a warning about the regime's domestic survival, and who believe that a negotiated settlement is the only outcome that preserves any version of the Islamic Republic that resembles what it was before February 28th. Those figures are currently losing the internal power struggle. But they exist, and the outcome of this conflict may ultimately depend on whether external pressure can shift the internal balance enough for them to prevail. The structural problem as it stands today, articulated with brutal precision by the Atalaya strategic analysis published in April, is this. The only figure who can authorize an agreement is Vahidi, the IRGC commander who controls the actual levers of power in Tehran. Vahidi has no institutional interest in an agreement that reopens the strait, which would eliminate both the IRGC's economic leverage and its claim to wartime primacy simultaneously. The figures who want an agreement, Pezeshkian, Arakchi, Ghalibaf, lack the authority to authorize it. This is not a negotiating impasse. It is a constitutional vacuum. And Washington may, as the analysis bluntly concludes, be talking to itself. Every Apache helicopter strike response, every Patriot interceptor fired over Kuwait, every diplomatic communication sent through Qatari mediators is being directed at a decision-making structure that is, by the admission of American intelligence officials, incompletely understood. The United States does not know with certainty who is giving orders in Tehran. It does not know whether Mojtaba Khamenei is recovering and will eventually assume functional control of the regime. It does not know whether the IRGC Military Council will remain the de facto sovereign authority indefinitely. It does not know whether Pezeshkian's reported resignation will accelerate the internal power struggle towards some resolution, or whether it will simply be suppressed and denied as IRGC-affiliated media is already attempting to do. What it does know, because its own intelligence officials have stated it directly, is that the Islamic Republic is currently a regime whose formal leadership structure and actual decision-making authority are not aligned. And a regime in that condition, a regime where the figures with authority do not want an agreement and the figures who want an agreement do not have authority, is not a regime that can be negotiated to resolution through the channels that Doha and Islamabad and Oman have been providing. After 100 days and 1 Apache helicopter and 21 missile attacks on 3 countries in a single night, the most consequential unknown in this conflict is not Iran's missile inventory. It is not the American munitions stockpile. It is not the trajectory of Patriot interceptor production. It is the answer to the question that a senior American official asked in March, and that no intelligence agency has yet fully answered. Who is actually in charge in Tehran? And until that question has a clear answer, every response that the United States calibrates, every ceasefire framework that mediators construct, every demand that Washington transmits through back channels, is being sent into a constitutional void. The Supreme Leader has vanished. The IRGC has moved into the vacuum. And the war continues, ordered by an institution whose interests are served by its continuation, directed at a command structure that nobody on the outside can fully map, and watched by a global audience that has no idea how it ends, because the figure with the authority to end it has not been reliably seen or heard in over 3 months. We will continue tracking this leadership crisis and every development in the conflict as it unfolds. If this level of depth is what you have been looking for, subscribe to the channel. We are also on Spotify. Thank you for watching.